On behalf of the Los Angeles and San Francisco steering committees, thank you for joining tonight's event, Entrepreneurship and Racial Equity. For those of you unfamiliar with StartOut, it is a US-based nonprofit organization founded in 2009 that focuses on empowering LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs. As a former StartOut employee, it is my great pleasure to be here with you today and also convey that the mission of StartOut is to really increase the number, diversity, and impact of LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs and amplify their stories to drive the economic empowerment of the community.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Lance, and I've been with StartOut for about 3 years, and I just wanted to touch on what StartOut offers as resources. So if you're a founder of a scalable tech or tech-enabled company, StartOut provides direct, individual support through community events like this one-on-one mentorship, office hours with experts, and investor connections. Also, the StartOut Growth Lab, which is a biannual accelerator. StartOut additionally offers 12-month scholarships for Black, Latinx, Womenx, and non-binary founders that may not be able to afford these resources as a giving member. So if you would like to become a member or just find out more information about StartOut, then I genuinely invite you to check out startout.org. Now, I want to give a big shout out to all of StartOut's national sponsors. The organization wouldn't be able to do what we do and wouldn't be able to make the magic without them. So big shout out to them. And let's get down to it. We're here to talk about some pretty important stuff. So first, I'd like to make some short introductions. From our wonderful host is Dominique Hollins, and she's our moderator tonight. She's the founder and connector-in-chief of We360, LLC, a boutique DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm that develops customized strategies for organizations that are committed to doing the work. She has over 15 years of experience working with a range of folks, from Fortune 500 companies to academic institutions, nonprofits, entrepreneurs, and so on. Dominique has become adept at community building for collective impact. Next up are our panelists. So first, we have Demetrius Curry. Demetrius is the CEO of College Cash, a fintech platform that helps to reduce student loan debt using everyday behavior. He's a motivational speaker who instills the importance of higher education and financial literacy to high-risk youth, and he encourages them to put their lives to better use by using his tough journey as an example. Demetrius is also currently in the StartOut Growth Lab. Our other panelist is Esther Tricoche. Esther is the Director of Investments at Kapor Capital, where she focuses on their LP investments and building a more diverse and impactful ecosystem. Spurred by her lived experience and a deep drive to level the playing field, Esther spent the last decade financing and supporting the growth of over 250 social ventures. They're all focused on products and services that address equity gaps for low-income populations and underrepresented communities. So with that, thank you all so much for being here, and I'll pass it to Dominique to dive in.
Thank you so much, Lance, and to the StartOut community. It is my honor and pleasure to be here with you all this evening. I have the honor and pleasure of having a fireside chat, if you will, with both Demetrius and Esther. And this panel might be a little different than what you're used to, because today we wanted to have a very open and unfiltered discussion. In order for us to get to the truth of the matter and what the experiences are for entrepreneurs of color. And then Esther is going to help explain what the other side of this battle is and how we can be better prepared. So the best way to kick this off is to get a little more information about how we can connect as to the panel. So I want to start with Demetrius, if you could just give us your story. And the one thing I'll note is I'm connected to Demetrius through Chicago, and I'm connected to Esther through the Kapor Center. So I'm happy to have this representation here. I'm super excited. So Demetrius, would you like to kick us off with a brief overview of how you came to be here today?
Sure. First of all, it's a true pleasure to be here with both of you and just be a part of this conversation. My journey has been a very interesting one. As you said, and as you referenced, originally I am from Chicago. Born and raised on the South Side, grew up pretty much what you would envision if you thought about a young man from the south side of Chicago. Ended up withdrawing from high school 3 months before graduation, went to the Marines, and that was probably one of the best decisions that I made, just because I was involved in a lot of really stupid things. Wasn't that I wasn't bright, I just didn't have the ecosystem around me to show or even talk about post-secondary education. It was a matter of just graduate and be happy you're alive. So after my time in the Marines, got out and continued to do dumb things because, once again, you lack that support system. And eventually somebody actually sat me down and I was able to realize that there was a difference that I could make in my life. And got my GED, went to Northern Illinois University, ended up working in finance, worked on Wall Street, worked on Madison Avenue, ended up working for lots of major corporations. But I've always given back because I realized that I'm an anomaly. So therefore, it's my duty to help youth who are going through the same things that I went through. So that's how we ended up getting here. And part of Growth Lab is because I am a tech founder, as they mentioned, and I created a platform. And Growth Lab was honestly a fantastic opportunity for both me as a person of color, a member of the LGBTQ community, and just as a founder to get the resources to get out of that orbit, I like to call it, of your ecosystems where you are and get that ability to take part in things like this. So that's how I got here.
And before we get to Esther's intro, would you mind telling us a little bit about the company that you founded?
Absolutely, appreciate it. College Cash is a fintech platform where we utilize aspects of ad tech such as user-generated content, or UGC, and we figured out a way to have brands and organizations be able to run the same type of advertising and marketing campaigns they currently do, but instead of compensating users directly, the money that they earn through the UGC campaigns goes directly to their student loan servicers, which means now it's tax deductible. So now you have a platform where people can get engagement, brands can grow awareness, but the benefit is the social impact of leveling the playing field of reducing student loan debt, because the actual statistics are staggering and scary. Student loan debt affects everything from possibilities of marriage, first home purchase, first car purchase, denial for credit cards, and it also affects small businesses because student loan debt has a direct correlation with the amount and number of small businesses that are started. And probably if people peel that back, they'll see that a majority of those people are underserved, underbanked gig economy workers. So we figured out a way to reach out to that population and be able to help remove that real big burden off of them. So that's what we do.
Thank you so much for the intro and for the work that you're doing. I look forward to diving more into that in just a moment, but I'd love to also hear from Esther and to get your intro for those who are joining us tonight.
Sure. So as mentioned, I'm Esther Tricoche, the Director of Investments at Kapor Capital. I'll share a little bit more about Kapor later, but to start on the personal side, I grew up in Texas in a Puerto Rican family, which is pretty rare in Texas. There are very few of us. Grew up truly under the poverty line. And I always felt like I had so many opportunities that weren't typically afforded to people who grew up in the way that I did. So decided really early on, I wanted to be a part of creating change. What that meant evolved over time. I originally started off in the sciences, and so focused on cognitive neuroscience and learning science. Dabbled a little bit in international human rights, and then kind of put the two pieces together, and was part of a fund that started about a decade ago that focused on the intersection of policy that affects the average everyday American in a handful of topics. And so led our work in education. And that turned into moving out here to the Bay Area, becoming an edtech investor, and then going global and focusing on edtech, on healthcare, on fintech. And so spent the majority of my career directly working with entrepreneurs, either through helping them via finance or helping to grow the companies in other ways. And then more recently joined Kapor Capital. And so now I am on the other side of the table from venture capitalists. And so I'm now investing into venture capital funds, and the rest of the team at Kapor Capital is themselves a venture capital fund directly investing into entrepreneurs. So happy to share a lot more there, but we'll be able to bring a few perspectives to the conversation.
Thank you so much. And it's actually very powerful to have you here because you can speak to both sides. And I think it's imperative that not only can Demetrius hear some of the things you might have experienced and also mirror that with what his experience might have been, but also for us to look for the landmines in this process, which leads me to the next question, Demetrius. Can you talk about what your process was for becoming an entrepreneur? From the moment you made the decision until you actively started to do the work. Can you just walk us through that piece? We'll get to your first investment later, but we want to know from someone who is hearing about this and now they're trying to break the mold and now they actually feel like they have the confidence and the faith of trying this system, this ecosystem. What is it actually like, especially for someone with a very diverse background? Tell us what that experience was for you.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. When I first started on the journey and decided I wanted to be an entrepreneur, one of the first things I had to do, and this is very interesting, is I had to humble myself and realize there was a lot for me to learn. But having said that, I had to make a decision to go learn it. Now, depending on where people are, and I mean that geographically, at this point in time, I was in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, to be exact. If you're there versus say Silicon Valley, San Francisco, Nebraska, the resources you have may be limited, but your desire to get that knowledge shouldn't be. So I watched everything I could on every platform. I absorbed knowledge like a sponge to be able to flesh out the idea that I had. But I also had to go through one more thing that they don't really teach you in the beginning. It's this thing called imposter syndrome. And a lot of first-time founders that come from non-traditional backgrounds, we will go through that because we could have fantastic ideas. But the problem is if you come from, and I'm just going to speak candidly, if you come from the hood, there's nobody telling you that that's a valid idea. There's nobody telling you, yeah, you can do this. Our support system doesn't really always promote that. Don't be a dreamer. Look, keep it real. You got the next $1 million idea? Yeah, okay, dude. Look, you need to go get this job though real fast. The resources aren't there. So once again, you're on your own. So you have to have some intestinal fortitude, so to speak. But I did. My entire first 6 months was trying to figure it out. And that means a lot of things you do wrong, which is sad because you miss opportunities, because they always say you only get one shot to make the first impression. Well, if you stumble into somebody and as opposed to walking up to them, that first impression is ruined. So then you have to reach out and find mentors, which is another thing. Reach out and find mentors in what you're doing. There's been an entrepreneur that started their own, because somebody in corporate America may not be the best mentor for you if you're trying to do your own thing. So I was lucky enough to find one, a gentleman by the name of Stan Corbin. He actually became a mentor, and he was a rough mentor. But it was worth it because he was preparing me for a lot of things that he knew I was going to go through. And I think that that's a responsibility a lot of us should take on, and not just, okay, I'm going to go to the local college or the local HBCU, or I'm gonna donate time to the entrepreneurship class at Stanford. No, go back to the same areas that some of you came from and understand those are the people that really need that polish, that really need that help. So I was lucky enough to find that person. So at that point in time, it just became, how can I emulate and mirror what I know they're going to be looking for without the same resources that they have? So that was the start of my journey.
That's really powerful for a couple of reasons. One, the very first thing you said is I have to humble myself. It is rare that I hear entrepreneurs admit that, right? There's the floss and the gloss of entrepreneurship, but people don't really glorify the work. And from what I'm hearing for you is that reality check set in. Then it was followed by your recognition that resources are limited, but your grit should not be. So you took the initiative to do what needed to be done for you to find that information. You realized you didn't know what you needed to know, and you stumbled along the way. You had the intestinal fortitude, and then you stumbled into a mentor. Now, Esther, when you hear all these stumbles and pivots and things he had to figure out, and if he wasn't who he is, he might not have made these decisions. How does this sound for stories you might have heard for other folks who are trying to get started? Is this similar? Are these common mistakes? Talk to us about what you hear from, I call it seedling founders who are just figuring it out and just getting involved.
Yeah. Demetrius, your story was beautiful, and it's a story I love to hear from founders. I wish the entire VC space was incredibly inclusive and really valued a wide range of experiences. I will say the challenge that I often see as an investor is if you have people in your network who you can tap to ask, hey, can you take a look at this pitch before I start fundraising? Or, hey, how do I structure this? Or even, hey, I'm thinking about this particular idea. How should I talk about it in a way that resonates to investors? I think it is, it's more difficult to not be able to have that access. But every single person goes through that same journey of learning and growing. And the great entrepreneurs are just like Demetrius. They soak up knowledge like a sponge. They really work hard to be able to craft something beautiful. We have a particular way of thinking about that. And very specifically, we look for entrepreneurs like that at Kapor Capital. I should probably give the whole spiel on Kapor to give context for who we are and what we do. But everyone's seen a Silicon Valley that is very stereotypically, white male, went to Stanford, starting a company. And every one of us know that a lot of credentialing systems are in and of themselves flawed. If you think, for example, about Ivy League colleges and the percentage of underrepresented students there, you start to realize that if that's what you're basing your sort of conceptions of who should be a founder on, you have a lot of systemic racism built into that. And so what we tend to think of is this term that we call distance traveled. And so the idea is that the best entrepreneurs aren't going to be the entrepreneurs who have a credential, who sort of fit a mold. They're going to be the entrepreneurs who have hustled, who have started off on first base and have gone all the way around to hit that home run. Not just those who have started off on third base and can walk it in. And so we absolutely love seeing people who are learning and growing. And I think the reality is, as you start your company, everyone's in the same spot, figuring it all out on the fly. It again just comes back to who can you tap into in your network to be able to bounce ideas off of and be able to navigate as you're raising capital at the same time.
Now, how does that work for someone who literally doesn't have that network, right? When we think about underrepresented minorities, we get told that all the time. Oh, just go to your network, and we're like, it doesn't exist. I am the network, right? I'm actually doing this today because I know there are folks behind me that need me to show them the way. And while Demetrius may love what you just shared, it doesn't change what he could tell somebody coming behind him. So to that end, where it feels like there's a gap between getting started and like raising funding, like there's a bridge there. Is Kapor Capital or the industry doing anything to get entrepreneurs from ideation and where do I get started to, all right, now I'm prepared for funding? Because there seems to be a huge gap in the preparation required for that difference.
Yeah. So specifically for Kapor Capital, actually, Dominique, I should probably give the full spiel because I realize you know Kapor and Demetrius as do you, but our listeners might not. So let me take a step back and then I'll talk about Kapor and our position in the market. And then I'll talk about some really neat things that I am seeing in the market that specifically meet those stages. So high level, Kapor Capital is one of 3 organizations that are part of the Kapor umbrella. We're based here in Oakland, California, and every one of the 3 organizations under the umbrella deeply focuses on essentially investing in underestimated talent. So 2 of those organizations are nonprofits. One focuses on STEM and primarily focuses on high school students. And the idea there is invest in talent and help more people to become part of the wealth building power of technology. And so that is primarily, I should say exclusively, underrepresented students of color. The second organization is the Kapor Center. And the Kapor Center is structured as a foundation. They do a little bit of grant making, but I would say more so they do a lot of research studies within the space, and they work a lot within the tech industry to essentially focus on the intersection of racial equality and tech. And then the third organization is Kapor Capital. So we're structured as a venture fund. We focus primarily on seed stage ventures, some pre-seed, some Series A. And what we look for across the board are companies who essentially are closing gaps of access or opportunity, either for lower income Americans or for racially underrepresented populations. We've invested in almost 200 ventures to date. About 35% of our founders are Black or Latino. That number is almost 60% if you sort of go up to women and all people of color. And then my arm of Kapor Capital focuses on investing in venture funds who align with our values, and so primarily focused on diversity. Are you in turn financing diverse founders? And then also on some form of impact lens, typically within a portion of their portfolio. So the specific question that you posed, I would say is most applicable within our pre-seed stage, although again, it's not the primary focus for Kapor. We're more of seed investors. Where I'm really seeing a lot of interesting things in the market is, I am knocking on wood because I hope this is around for the long haul. I'm starting to see a lot of changes in the VC sector, specifically as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so in the last few months, I'm starting to see a lot more early stage resources pop up, a lot more that is specifically aiming to support underrepresented founders. And so things like incubator / accelerator programs with connections into the VC industry. There's a VC training program called Rebel One that puts out a ton of content on not only being an investor, but also being an entrepreneur who's pitching investors. And so I think more and more there's democratization of information. I will say it's still always a challenge when you don't have somebody to turn to, and I can deeply appreciate that. I really didn't know about the venture capital industry until after college, and I had nobody who I could turn to at that point in time to really understand what the industry was about. So as a result, I came into it a little bit later. I think in events like this, there are always many opportunities to ask questions. And so I'm really curious to hear questions from the audience when the timing is appropriate. But I would say between this concept of VC being hugely about brand differentiation, you start to see more and more blog posts and Twitter posts and just putting out information that otherwise would be opaque in the world. And I think that will be one small part of of democratizing more information and access.
Thank you. That was the bridging the gap that we wanted to hear. So Demetrius, we in planning for this conversation, we were talking about the things that the VCs should be doing to prepare for the communities they're not used to interacting with. And what are they doing to get ready for us while we're trying to get ready for them? So bringing it back to your story, now that you've heard some of the things that are happening on the investor side, can you talk to us about your journey towards getting your first round of funding, what that is or was like? And some of the things you were told along the way. So we can see if Esther hears something similar or if this is common for those who are seeking funding.
No problem. You keep giving me lots to unpack. So first, and I'm going to preface this because, as Esther said, I am familiar with Kapor Capital and the three arms. And so what I'm going to address is primarily pre-seed and under. Because it's great if you can see the companies if they make it to pre-seed, but a lot of us don't. And then this is what I would say, this is the part that I think I know this is what I'm extremely passionate about, because you don't get to see a lot of what the possibilities are because we don't make it there. I personally have seen, I know, because I decided to count last night in preparation of this, 29 different companies that over the past 3 years no longer exist because they couldn't even get to a pre-seed level. Now, I also decided to take a look at where were they based? What ecosystems were they coming out of? And going from idea to, okay, I think I have something that's worth showing somebody, okay, that's fine. But when you get to that point that you want to show somebody, this is where things get murky a little bit. And I use that in the best possible term. Because we're being held to the same standards. As you were talking about earlier, you can earn life experience credit if you're trying to get a degree. You can use life experience when you're trying to get a job. If you're trying to do accounting for 15, you've been doing it for 15 years versus somebody who just got their degree in accounting, more likely you might get the job. We don't get the same thing. There's nobody there to, I don't want to say be a translator, but for the most part, yeah. How do you translate real world skills into what you're looking for? And it's funny because I hear it, and as founders, we hear the rhetoric, and there's organizations, and it's funny you mentioned Twitter and other places, because there's plenty of people on Twitter with real fast Twitter fingers, but that's all they're doing. Mm. They talk a good game, and it's like, oh, okay, we want diverse founders. Do you really? Because if you want diverse founders, then you have to acknowledge the diversity in our backgrounds and say, okay, how can we look at the skill sets? Oh, we want founders to have grit, determination, and stick to itness, and show us where you failed before and made it through, so we can. Have you looked at my life? That's what most founders should really be saying. Yeah. And this isn't me, but I'm looking at it as a blanket statement. We escaped uncertain circumstances. We made it out. Look at the schools you went to. Look at the family situations we came out of. Take that into account. But nobody is. They expect us, as I told somebody before, and I promised the group that I would be myself. So a lot of organizations, incubators, accelerators, pitch days, demo days, they ask for founders of color, especially this year. It's been a proliferation of them. But the reality is you're saying you want Raheem, but you really want Tad. And you expect Raheem to have Tad's same credentials, and quite frankly, we don't. So what can you give us credit for? How can you meet us at a point where you can say, like Kapor does, distance travel, give us some credit for the distance travel? And nobody's really doing that. There's very few organizations. Kapor, fantastic at doing that. But the problem is, before that pre-seed, we're being filtered out before we can even get there. There's certain organizations, like, and I can say this because I have firsthand experience. Like a positive example, Dominique, is when I was in Columbus, Ohio, no degree, GED, I'm quite transparent about my background. That does not eliminate the possibility that I could actually have a good business idea. There was an organization called Loud Capital. They didn't care about that. they judge me based on the merits of what I brought to them and said, hey, we can help get you some more. We'll help bring you some more further. Those organizations like that are few and far between.
Mhm.
And so they can only do so much. Kapor can only do so much. But if the deal flow and what you're able to see isn't even making it to the table, you know, it's interesting because I think one of the good examples I gave is, how can you have programs for underserved founders if all these organizations don't have any? And underserved and overlooked, that's different. Just because somebody is a minority or diverse doesn't mean they went through the same thing. You could take two African-American males, and if you came from a two-parent household and lived in the suburbs, went to prep school, we are not the same. Who's the translator? Who's the interpreter? You have to have somebody on the teams that understands that and can actually translate that to how could we say this was good enough? Or don't just say no. Don't just ghost people. Tell them where they can become better. If the idea is crap, the idea is crap. But if the idea was good, but you're basing it on team, which is a whole different story, then tell them what they can do. Now, the other part is, it's almost like I tell somebody, my analogy is, if you wanted to open a store in a community and you wanted, your intention was to serve the Hispanic community, but nobody at your store spoke Spanish. And then you complain and wonder why you're not getting customers. Who's it really for? You know, there's a lot of lip service and self-serving that goes on. And I'm talking about the incubators and accelerators, because let's be honest, those are the things that get us to the pre-seed level. And if they're all looking for the same thing, doing the same thing, and if anybody ever really wants to have an interesting moment, take a look at companies that apply for some of these incubators and accelerators, then look at the ones that are selected and see where the commonalities are. Not the diversity, but see where the commonalities are. And you'll start to see where the gaps really are, because everybody can't come from those. Everybody didn't come from college. And if they did, I mean, everybody applied did? No. So that, and some of the things, and I think, Dominique, you asked some of the things I heard on my journey. Oh, that's, let's see.
Remember the $100,000?
Okay, so yes, the verbiage needs to change too, because there's a couple of things like, oh, you have to lean startup. I think we've lean startup that everybody on this summit should understand. I've heard the lean startup strategy. I heard that, and I actually told the person that said it to me, I don't need to read that book, because you can't tell anybody who's ever been homeless for a prolonged period of time anything about being lean. When you know how to make $50 stretch a week, you can't tell me, what do you think I'm gonna do? I'm gonna take those same principles and apply them to the business that I'm building. You don't have to tell me how to scale it down. I know how to make 5 packs of ramen noodles, a pack of hot dogs, and some ketchup turn into a whole meal for 3 days. That might be a stretch, it might not be. But the bottom line is, things are different. And somebody has to understand those differences when you start dealing with the founders you say that you want to actually engage and make better and bring up there. Such as, oh, well, you know, anything less than 200,000, 250,000, that's friends and family around. We don't really deal with that. Friends and family for who?
Yeah.
Look at the economic situation of most of the major metropolitan areas where these incubators and accelerators clamor to get applicants from, or the VCs or all these funds go to, and they say, well, that's friends and family. Who's friends and family? Because Esther, I'm sure you can even imagine, if when you first were like, you know, say 22, 23, and you were like, oh, if you had a business idea, understanding where your situation growing up, you might not have been able to raise 150,000 from friends and family.
It
But
wouldn't have anyone to turn to.
exactly, but they say it as if it's to be expected. No, right there where we have a disconnect. Well, how much do you think you can raise? How much have you put in? Bruh, let me explain. I sold plasma to pay hosting fees. If I had anything else, I would have done it. Most of my friends and family think I'm actually crazy for trying to start my own business. Do you really want me to talk to them? No. So smaller checks, validate an idea. That's an interesting concept. And that was one of the things that I'll use Lab as an example that they did really great. They gave a couple of smaller checks to validate the concept, because the concept is valid, then put the resources behind that you need on a step up scale. Look at it like high school. A student comes into high school, a freshman. It takes multiple tests and exams. What do you think would happen if a student walked in high school freshman year and a teacher said, all right, so here's your graduation test?
Yeah.
But that's what we get. And there's no middle ground. And then wonderful organizations like Kapor, Growth Lab, StartOut, other organizations up and down the coast, they never see us. We never make it out of our ecosystems. Ohio, Michigan, Pittsburgh, we don't make it out. We're getting filtered out. So the conversation needs to change. The way that we're looked at, and Esther, I so love how you said that, the distance traveled. They would start giving us some credit for that, because I'm gonna tell you right now, we who have gone through things are much better suited for those times when things get hard than some people who haven't. But somebody asked me the other day, they said, what's it like being an entrepreneur in tech? I said, the first thing is you have to understand that everything that's written, don't read, because you'll get mad. You'll get mad when you're sitting here on TechCrunch and or any of these other places, you see, oh, so-and-so got funded $2 million for an idea from a napkin. Why? Because they met when they were at Stanford. Meanwhile, we're going through everything to have the same stuff to bring to the organizations. And we're struggling for 50,000 validation or 100,000, that's friends and family. There's nobody playing in that level. There's nobody writing checks that small stuff for angels. Then goes to another question. How do those individual founders get to those angels? And then those angels still, people have subconscious preconceived notions. There's a lot of training that needs to be done. Okay, yeah, if somebody says, where did you live? Cabrini Green, projects, Chicago, South Side. Automatically, something pops up. Does that make me any less or better than a founder of somebody that grew up in the Hamptons? No, but get to know me and my distance traveled first. So I really love that. And I think that those are the conversations and types of training. I don't want to call them underserved translators, but something needs to be done. Have people in the room for these incubators and accelerators that have come from these backgrounds. And I say this very interestingly. There's a movie called Head of State with Chris Rock. And I love this analogy. When they had a debate scene, he said, how are you going to have a war on crime when you've never committed a crime? How are you going to have a war on poverty when you've never been broke? How are you going to have a war on drugs when you've never smoked weed? I feel like this. How are you going to try to help underserved founders when you don't have any?
Yeah.
And you don't let us in the room, much less, oh my God, get us on staff? But they love our scrappy stories.
Thank you so much, Demetrius. These are the stories I need people to hear, especially if you are investors in the room. You may hear these stories abstractly, but this is the reality that many of the founders are going through. This is not made up. Here are a couple of things that I heard. When you mentioned an interpreter, we talked about that. There is a need to adequately highlight the transferable skills in a way that fits the prototypical white male that you and your organization have let in. So if it requires grit, well, what kind of grit? Is it like grit through an algebra or biology class while also having a sports team? Or is it grit from trying to get food for a week and stretching it on $50? Like, how are we measuring grit? And when it talks about pulling yourself by your bootstraps, what does that actually mean? And what school? And how do we address this pipeline by not putting the blame just on the talent? What are we doing to, as the Kapor Center has conducted much research on, how are we filling the leaky tech pipeline? What are we doing to fill the holes? Because again, we may attract the talent, but once Demetrius gets in the room and he realizes that this room was not made for him, how is he expected to be successful and yet measured by the same caliber? So Esther, as you hear this story, and I heard the nods, the head nod. Oh, also you mentioned the sensitivity training. Where is the in-depth training happening for the VCs? And I heard, Esther, you talked about the VC training program, Rebel One. there needs to be an immersive conversation that has happened on both sides of the coin, because the blame is being tossed around, but we're not adequately investing the way that we could on both sides of the table. So Esther, as you listen to this story, as you are sitting in the shoes on both sides, anything that stuck out that is, that happens in the pre-seed stages, and how we can kind of break through that?
Yeah. Three things really stuck out that you mentioned, Demetrius. So one on geography. And so I want to touch on that. Two on representation. And three, I want to see you phrased it as attitudes, or I forget the exact word. I tend to call it assumptions, and the assumptions we have of certain founders. And I'm using the global we as humans. And so on the geography side, something like 80 to 90% of venture capital goes to companies who are based in either California, New York, or Boston. And I think that that is something that, interestingly enough, is changing within the industry in large part based on valuations. And so people are realizing there's I think there can be a strong wave of elitism in Silicon Valley about tech here is better, tech here is fill in the blank. Completely not true.
Yeah.
And I say this as somebody who's from Texas, and Texas is not known for tech. There's some great tech in Texas. There's some great VCs in Texas as well. And so more and more, I'm starting to see funds, accelerators, et cetera, pop up across the country in response to that. And so I'm excited to see that trend continue. And it's also something that I'm very conscious about when I'm investing in venture capital funds. The second piece is around representation. And so, I mean, we probably all had the experience of being in the room and being the only in some way, right? For me, it's been the only Latina, the only woman of color, the only woman, period, at many times. And so, Demetrius, to the translator piece that you're talking about, I feel like part of it is this sense of, you know the word for it exactly, but the sense of, I understand this person, I understand the struggles that they've had. Like we're now in the middle of a research study. Dominique, you mentioned some of the research that Kapor Center puts out. We're in the middle of a research study specifically to understand the amount of dollars raised and the experiences that both founders and general partners, so the fund managers themselves, are facing as they're going out to raise, and how that differs based on gender and race. And so I think the other half of the translational piece, one is just a sense of understanding. The second, I think, is really examining biases. And investors need to do so much better on getting real about examining biases. And so here are the top 3 biases that I've seen across the space. And I will also be honest and say I have committed number 1. I've had to check myself. But number 1 is really, I think the other part of something that you're describing, Demetrius, around this translator piece. And so, and I think number 1 is the specific language that VCs are used to hearing. Sometimes you'll have entrepreneurs come in who haven't met with VCs before. This is their first conversation, and they have a fantastic business, but they're talking about their growth in terms of, I'm adding X number of institutional customers, and they're not talking about ARR and MRR and recurring revenue and all of these sort of keywords that investors who are seeing, hundreds of things are just sort of used to picking up on. And I think the assumption here is this thought of like, hey, can this business really grow if I'm not hearing things in the way that I'm used to hearing things? Am I willing to put in the effort to understand, are we talking about the same thing, but just using different language, or are we actually on 2 different pages? And I in particular remember a situation, I want to say it was 6 or 7 years ago, with a founder who had an amazing business that he was building, and he wasn't speaking in that typical Silicon Valley language. And one of my team members was like, "No, this is exactly what he means." And this light clicked for me, of realizing I'm actually committing this assumption myself. And so I think it's something that I constantly check myself on. And as an investor, if ever I don't understand something that someone's telling me, I'll rephrase it and ask them again, and really seek to understand somebody instead of making quick assumptions. The second two, I think, are bit more pernicious. So one is that I've often seen, and I would say maybe has shown up in the media more often in the context of women-owned businesses targeting markets where primarily women are the customer, but it could apply with a racial lens as well, and it does based on your business model. But if you look at who's on the other side of the table in the VC world right now, overwhelming majority are white and are male. And so just looking at fund managers in general, less than 1% of fund managers are Black or Latino. I want to say it's 95% of fund managers are male. And so I think the assumption here, and it goes back to seeking to understand, is if I as an investor don't have the life experience in the particular market that you're targeting, do I dig in and try to understand it? Or do I say, no, this is too small of a market, or this isn't a good market? And again, you'll hear stories all the time of women who are creating companies. I really love How I Built This. Guy Raz's How I Built This. And so one of my favorite in this case was, there's a clothing subscription service whose name is escaping me right now. But the founder went on and talked about how she pitched VCs, and they asked their secretaries, they asked their wives. Stitch Fix, exactly.
Okay.
But they had no understanding of that market because their lived experiences didn't intersect with it. And that is a bias to realize and to address for investors. And then I think that the third bias is the worst. And this is one that any silver lining is people are starting to more openly talk about now. Although I think it's still incredibly pervasive in the investor space, much less in society as a whole. And that's racism and sexism, right? Making assumptions about people based on who they are. And I think that happens all the time in the VC sector. And that's something that VCs have to call out. They have to be a part of that change if they truly want, if the whole purpose of VC is to find great companies and to find them early at great valuations and to be differentiated. So to have very different pipeline than other folks, like you've got to find the people who are creating the fantastic companies, who are being overlooked, who are the diamonds in the rough. That's really going to be your superpower, and that's going to be how you generate returns. And I talked about what we do at Kapor Capital. We decided to openly publish last year our return profile, which VC funds don't do. Ours is at 3x, which is in the top quartile of all VC funds of our size. And we put that out there in large part to prove that investing in impact pays off, and investing in diverse founders pays off. And there are a whole host of studies that also show that. Kaufman has a great study out that talks about return profiles being 20 to 30% larger with diverse teams. And so I think it's something that people are starting to talk about a lot more now, are waking up to in some cases now. And there is a lot of work to go within the VC community, a lot of work.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for those 3 points, because I do equity and inclusion consulting in the tech industry for the workplace. But I bring in all of the elements of the ecosystem, because literally nothing you said was different than the exact same thing I talk about in hiring and recruiting and in the C-suite and in the boardroom. Like, this is no different, Demetrius. So unfortunately, there's more rejection in other forms of our economy, and it doesn't excuse it. In fact, it pushes us all to be more active in dispelling that. So I want to highlight for our participants several things that you brought up. The language, right? The lingo always gets us dejected. In fact, right now, companies are working on taking out language from resumes and for job applications, because they are automatically excluding folks. So if you are an investor in the room, or if you're an entrepreneur in the room, as an entrepreneur, I would encourage you to do your research on the VC companies that you are engaging. Who do they typically go for? What do their portfolios look like? Why? So you have an understanding of what they're looking for. And if you are outside of that, how do you better align yourself with an organization, or pitch the value proposition you add for differentiation for their portfolio? It requires a savviness. If you are an investor, I need you to release some of the privilege you have in deciding whether or not you want to consider alternative language. And why I say that is, Esther, you said some investors have to determine if they are willing to put in the effort to entertain a pre-seed founder. By nature of the willingness, that's privilege. So either you have a diversity effort or you don't. And if you do have a diversity effort, there is no, well, should I listen to them? Yes, because you have a diversity initiative, because they don't get that ear time. So this is the way to do that. So working on the language to be able to capture those transferable skills that are otherwise missed. Part 2 is representation. Right now, they're seeking out women because gender diversity is the new profitability scheme. And the way to go, when it's actually just fairness, and there aren't any women in these VC firms, so they don't know what questions to ask. They don't know that hair care is more than a $65 billion industry. And when women were trying to pitch that, it was like, is hair care really that valuable? Actually, it is. So by having that representation in the room is essential. And as investors, if you're listening, if you know that you have pre-seed entrepreneurs coming, you need to get someone from that background to say, hey, can you sit in on this meeting? Can you help me to evaluate that maybe I'm missing something? That you might think you're the smartest in the room, but in this context, from their experience, you might miss how they got to this point, having absolutely no funding, but the gentleman over there got $100,000 in funding and is nowhere near as far as he should be with that type of investment. So excuse me while I push this language. I just want you all to hear what Esther just shared. These choices, choosing to be inclusive when it is currently a necessity and just the right thing to do. And the last one is, racism and sexism is real. If you are uncomfortable having the conversation, you are probably in a position of privilege because it makes you uncomfortable. Brene Brown literally said, your unwillingness to have this discussion is an exact example of your privilege. It needs to be talked about because you can't address a problem that we can't acknowledge is real. So for those who are sexist and racist, they're not going to come out and say it. They will just continue to make the same decision. So let's highlight and elevate those investors and those entrepreneurs that are supporting diverse groups, that are putting their best foot forward. And I just wanted to capture that, Esther, because it's so powerful.
And I think when I mentioned the decision, making a decision about it, what I'm referring to is there's a term that has a terrible reputation in my perspective in the VC space, and that's pattern recognition. This concept of you're working at such volume, like for example, at Kapor Capital, we see 3,000 deals a year, right? So you want to quickly go through things and you have mental shortcuts on things. And so it's really making the choice of, am I really looking strongly at everyone who comes in the door, or am I relying on mental shortcuts? And if so, how do I sit down and examine what mental shortcuts do I have? Because pattern recognition can also be positive. Like I shared earlier, our distance traveled piece, that's part of our pattern recognition. That is written into our investment memos. It's that important to us. And so I think every VC really needs to think through what patterns am I looking for? Why? And are those patterns truly getting me to diverse founders, to great companies? All of these sorts of questions.
These patterns exclude.
Yeah.
I would push these
Yeah.
VCs to say, if we're using pattern recognition, who does it further and who is excluded by nature of this process, and what can we do about it? So I'm pushing investors and VCs to be more critical of the language, because the softening of the language takes away from the sense of urgency.
Yeah.
Dominique, and excuse me, I'm gonna jump in here something, because on the entrepreneur side, I want to add something, and I'm looking at some of the comments in the chat, and I'm glad something was just recently said. Since we're speaking to the VCs and investors, I also want to speak to the founders.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
a level of accountability we have to have. Now, one of my favorite sayings is, we don't want special treatment, just equitable treatment.
Say it one more time.
We don't want special treatment, just equitable treatment.
All right.
Now, there's a responsibility that us as founders should also bear. So I'm going to address this right here. We need to know, like you said, Dominique, know who you're dealing with, know who you're going to go to, at least have the basic starting blocks of what you want to do. So take that time, put that work in. We have to, because let's just be real, knowledge is free. With the internet, you can Google or YouTube anything. I've learned how to do everything from pro formas to just everything, because I had the desire to. So if you're not willing to put in the work, we can't really be mad if we didn't at least meet the investors halfway. So we may not have the full lingo, but just like Esther was saying, we don't talk about ARR and MRR. But if we understand what the investors are looking for, we can speak to that they can go, okay, that's what they're trying to say. Mm-hmm. But we have to get to that point first. Yep. So there's an accountability that we have to hold ourselves to, which is why, going back to this, we need to reach back and start establishing that. Because keeping in mind that a lot of the founders that are stuck in that position are coming from areas where they had to do it themselves, put it together, do the best they can. Pitch deck looks like crap, but they try to throw it together. They cold email it, submit it through a form, and there's nobody that's helping them do that because they're pre-seed. They're before pre-seed. So we need to establish some form of outreach, some kind of literacy, some kind of curriculum that, like Founders Gym does a fantastic job of that. There's other organizations that do fantastic jobs of that, to get you to that point that you can understand the basics. We need to establish more programs like that in different parts of the country, where, like major metro areas, Chicago, Detroit, just something to start that we can go to for a resource. Because right now the internet is our resource, and we all know how that works out sometimes. West Coast wants pitch decks this way, East Coast wants it this way, South wants it this way. No pictures, white with black letters. Then over here you want pictures. We need to be able to give a starting point. And then it's not special treatment, just equitable. Understand the distance traveled. What did we go through to get here? Give us some credit for that. We need that. And that's just, it's for underserved founders across the board, be it black, white, because guess what? The challenges I face coming from the south side of Chicago are the same ones faced from a student coming from Juarez, a student coming from Detroit, a student coming from Harlingen, Texas, a student coming from an Appalachian mining community. We can all look different, but we have the same challenge. So the only way things are gonna be made better across the board, get those people in the room. And guess what? I'll say this right now. If organizations don't have anybody that can speak that, well, guess what you do when you need somebody that speaks Spanish, or you need somebody that does sign language, and you don't have one, you go find one. Don't use that as an excuse that we don't have anybody. You didn't have an accountant until you hired one. Mm-hmm. Quit playing with us. Okay? So I would say we need that. And then be advocates. If you see, like, even in the VC community, Esther, Kapor does a fantastic job. Other ones do. You know what? Hold each other accountable. Hold each other accountable. If you see deal flow as is, because you all talk, we know you all talk, both good and bad. You can syndicate a deal. Well, guess what? Syndicate change.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Thank you, Demetrius. I mean, that's super powerful. Let's be clear. We're not asking for special treatment. And I say we as a person of color who's also an entrepreneur. This is what equity looks like. If everybody is supposed to get a piece of pie, or if everybody can get access to a slice of pie or a slice of pizza, but this group already has one. Maybe they got 2 and 3 slices. I don't know how they got 2 and 3 slices because it's only so much. They got 2 and 3 slices. Now we want to say pause on the 2 and 3. Oh no, or we can continue to go with the 2 and 3 slices. But this entire population over here, they don't have a slice of the pie at all. They are dealing with the crumbs because by the time they reach for the pie, it's been snatched from under them from people who were already at the table. And so for that, I'm saying if you're sitting here listening, you're like, again, they want special treatment. We were already cheated from beginning. The jumps and hoops we had to go through to get here were not considered for our peers, and we are measured on the same table. And that's what we're seeing in every area of our economy, in every form of our government and these companies. This conversation should be old by now, but when you're in a position of privilege, why would you let go of that power? So I just want to be very critical about this language as we think about both sides. And also, entrepreneurship is very special. Not everybody can just be an entrepreneur. And I'm not speaking based on capability. I'm talking about mindset. So if you have already chosen to be an entrepreneur, the assumption is you're going to do the work to be ready to be in the room. And then you recognize what you don't have, and you're going to do as much as you can until you get to a point where you simply cannot. And the VC community should have mechanisms in place to meet you where you get stuck in order to bridge the gap in this leaky pipeline. So I just wanted you all to be very conscious of both sides. And really quickly, before we go into questions, Demetrius, you don't have any idea who's on this line or who knows who. As an entrepreneur, if you could tell investors anything, you had one more thing you wanted to say besides mentorship that you need, the sponsorship that you need, the funds that you need, the training and sensitivity training you need them to take. What else would you want as investors to know from you directly as you seek more support and funding in this journey?
Step outside your comfort zone. You know, everybody wants to hit a home run. That's fantastic. But an entire team, every player doesn't hit home runs. They all have to go through something. And if you only had the players that batted, you know, let's just say above 700, you wouldn't have a team. But you still have those people on the team. Take a risk. You can maybe, let's use me for example. Yes, we're in the middle of fundraising. Fine. Maybe you can't do something. Say, oh, well, you know what? Let's throw a little something behind him. Let's put some effort. Okay, maybe we need to polish this a little bit, rather than just saying, no, we can't do this, and turn your back, which is what everybody's doing. And so I would say, take a chance, be that voice of change, put your toe in the water of the pool. Fine. You don't have to just jump in completely. But here's the thing, if you put an effort in, then you can see results and start to quantify those results, and you can extrapolate them. Say, okay, well, I did 50,000 3 times. We got a 4x return, 5x, 10x return on that 50. But what if we had given them 500? But you got to start somewhere. Quit using the excuse that that's friends and family. Realize most of us don't have friends and family. So cut that out. Start small checks fast. Validate the idea. If we get some traction, start letting those things count more than who we look like that reminds you of somebody else that you funded, what school we went to because it's prestigious. Because let me tell you something. I have nothing, my business is higher education loan reduction. But I can tell you right now, the School of Life and the University of Hard Knocks need to start giving us credit for that too and start factoring that in somewhere with that distance travel. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much. And the only edit I would say is we do have family, but our family looks like us and we're in similar situations and they're not trying to be entrepreneurs. They couldn't if they wanted to. So even if we wanted to go to family, we couldn't because they're just like us. So exactly. We're in the same ecosystem. So thank you so much, Demetrius. I hope for those who are listening, if you are looking to build a DEI strategy, or you're trying to figure out what Demetrius is here, he is raising funds and he is looking for someone willing to help shape the future and possibly be a mentor to other VCs so he can be your interpreter in the room. Just put it out there. Food for thought.
I'd be happy to any day of the week. It's part of responsibility. For whom much is given, much is required. You got to give back or there's going to be no future deal flow.
Absolutely. And then thank you so much. And then Esther, on the flip side of that, to all the to your fellow investors, what would you say, right? As he just asked, how can you all hold each other accountable? So what would you say to fellow investors and VCs, et cetera? And then what would you say to entrepreneurs on both sides of the table so that they have some encouragement as they are navigating this ecosystem?
Yeah. I would say to investors, get super tactical. Really seek to understand why you have the outcomes that you have now. Even as tactical as going through your funnel and understanding, are you getting a lot of diverse entrepreneurs at the top of the funnel? And if not, why? What relationships do you need to build to strengthen that? And then why are people falling out of your funnel? What are the big reasons? And truly ask yourself, are these legitimate? Are these about the business? And be real, right? If you really want to create change and you really want to use this moment in time of stronger social consciousness, it really starts at home. I would also say really think through examining your biases. And one very tactical way that you can do that, Demetrius, to tie into what you shared, give people feedback. Force yourself to write your feedback or to share your feedback. And if something's off about it, you're going to know it, right? And if so, use that to really change the way that you're looking at things. And then I would just say, finally, for entrepreneurs, if you don't get that feedback, ask for it. Sometimes people won't offer it. Again, it's a volume issue, right? There are 3,000 people. Some VCs are really great about giving it all the time, or at least giving it if you have made it to a certain part of their process, if you're sort of later stage in the pipeline. But it never hurts to ask. And then I'd also say, keep on keeping on. Entrepreneurship is so incredibly hard. And fundraising is, I've been on both sides of the house with it. It's a really tough process. And the number one thing that VCs are looking for is really a founder that they can believe in. And so talk about your distance traveled. I think, well, I would say, talk about your distance traveled with the realization that, even think about mine. I didn't share it for a long time because I thought I would be penalized for it and people would actually think about me in a negative way. But people talk about it, talk about why you understand the problem that you are seeking to address, and how you understand it so much that you are the person to bet on in this particular sector. And yeah, just keep on keeping on.
Thank you so much, Esther. To all of those who are still with us, as you prepare your questions, I ask that you send them one at a time so we can kind of moderate those. And then I'll have a couple of closing remarks that I'd like to say as we start to get our questions coming through. I believe Tony is going to help highlight some of those questions if I missed them, but thank you for those who have been commenting along the way. One thing I want to say, and just a correction to the statement you made, Esther, and a lot of folks are doing this. You said, consider your pipeline for more diverse entrepreneurs. I would correct that to say underrepresented entrepreneurs. And I think that because right now we have an issue across industries everywhere where people are like, we need diverse hires. We need more diverse, et cetera. Let's be clear. We want more underrepresented members, and that is across race, gender, and sexual orientation. You can't get off the hook by saying we do have a diverse portfolio. We have a fintech company, and we have an ed tech company, and we have a fashion company. And yes, of course, they're all run by white men, but we have diversity across industry. No, you missed the point. We are sitting here today talking about equity that is impeding wealth generation. We know that you understand the problem. There is, I'm going to say that there is a choice here. I've been told repeatedly by investors, and I don't know if they were doing this on purpose or not. I've had several white men say, do you know what investors care about? And I was like, no, because I'm not one. But I was like, no, tell me. On all occasions, they said greed or fear. And I was devastated because every person that said it was a white man, and it let me know that we were up for against the challenge. The greed is we want to make as much money as possible, as fast as possible before everybody else catches up in the market. The second one is fear. This is a loss. We can't afford to take this loss. Or if we don't do this now, we will lose out. So when they look at you, they're only measuring those two cases. So if we really want to get into diversity, equity, and inclusion, I need you to recognize there are emerging markets, that white men are a population that is decreasing in the United States and in many other areas. So if we look at a growing demographic of younger and entrepreneurs, people of color, and people with a certain sexual orientation, you will be behind the times. So you either invest now and protect against that fear, or do it later while you're trying to catch up, or you do it now to be greedy, I guess, so that you're ahead of the game. Whatever you need to convince yourself. These are the stories we're hearing. And yeah, it sounds like crap. Yeah, it does. So I'm telling y'all now, this is what it is. And if you are a person of color or someone who's underrepresented, you don't like that, this is the reality you're navigating, in addition to the nice things they tell you they're trying to figure out. So now I need us to do the work. It is underrepresented talent. And then lastly, if you're an investor, if you can diversify your 401k and your personal investments, you should definitely know how to diversify your portfolio, your book of business, your talent. Your biggest asset at your company is your human capital. But if your human capital is homogenous, then that 35% of the diversity profitability case will never be met, because you have not prepared yourself to have the tools ready to actually achieve those goals. So either you want to do it or you don't. And so I just encourage you all to lean into that. So now I'm happy to take questions, but I don't see any questions, and I'm sure our panelists would like to answer some. So thank you for everyone who I see in the chat. I love this. I like to speak truth to power. Esther, I love that you're in this position. You are the person in the room that Demetrius needs. Demetrius, you're the person in the room that more people need to see so that they know they can become this as well. Deacon has a comment. It's not a question, but I receive it. Oh, he sent it. Okay, let's see. Let's see what we can find. And if you want to copy and paste, I'm happy to see that. Anyone else who has a question, or Demetrius or Esther, if you have a comment that you want to add. I know I kind of went on a mini tangent, but Soka said, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? This is a serious question, an honest opinion, please.
You want to take that one, Esther?
I could. I'm interpreting the question in a certain way, but when you say, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? I guess to Soka who wrote it, do you mean within the fundraising process overall, as you think about the industry and how it needs to shift? What is your question referring to?
And we'll give Soka a moment to respond. And while fundraising overall, and I'm assuming, I'm sorry, I said she, but I'm not sure. So fundraising overall, but wait, racial equity, of course.
Big questions. How do I start on the racial equity side? I will say, so I mentioned I'm Puerto Rican. I grew up not speaking Spanish at home. I learned later in life, in large part because my dad, who grew up in New York City in a time where there were a lot of racial tensions, didn't want his children to experience racism and a lot of things that went with it that he experienced as a Spanish speaker. The world is very different today. And my hope for it would be the dramatic change that happened for him, who's now 80, and me, will be just as dramatic between me and my own children. I shared some of the changes that I'm starting to see in the VC space, and I want to be absolutely clear that this is the beginning. And I also want to be very clear that this is something that makes me hopeful, and at the same time, I'm not holding my breath. So I would say for all of it, there is a moment in time right now where social consciousness is much higher than it has been, and where people are willing to have conversations and think critically in ways that they glossed over previously. And so I do think this is an important moment in time for the intersection of investment and racial diversity. On the fundraising piece, fundraising is a slog. So I don't blame you for the question. And I know you truly do mean it in a serious way. I would say the light on the other side of the tunnel, and Dominique, to mention the feedback that you got about fear and about greed. Light on the other side of the tunnel is when you find investors who are truly willing to be partners, who are willing to help you grow the company. They are going to make introductions to potential customers, make introductions to follow-on investors later. And they're not going to be the type of investors that will put greed ahead of everything. There's something that we've done a lot with our own portfolio, specifically around advising them as they're raising money to not raise too much money, which sounds counterintuitive, right? You raise too much money, you give away too much ownership of your company, you no longer have direction over the control of your company. And I think the type of investors who would really take your interests as a founder, your intention for the company at heart, are going to be the people who you want to partner with. And so if you get through the fundraising process and find those people, they're the light at the end of the tunnel that help you to continue to grow the business and add fuel to the work that you're already doing. So that might sound a little bit trite, but that is my hope for folks at the end of the fundraising process, that they find an investor that's really well matched.
Thank you, Esther. And on that note, I'm going to make a correction. Not every investor cares about greed or fear. Unfortunately, it's just a common theme. And quite frankly, if we had more investors that thought about things outside of that, we would have more of an equitable ecosystem. But clearly, something must be going on. Now, Demetria, same question as an entrepreneur. She talked about, well, no, Soka asked specifically for fundraising overall. So I won't have you answer that question unless you're super passionate about it. But I also don't see any other questions right now. So you're welcome to respond to it as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to combine them. Fundraising overall, even regarding racial equity. Do I see a light at the end of the tunnel? Yes, I do. And unlike previous years before, where things were a lot of lip service and knee-jerk reactions and PR, where that light was usually attached to the train about to run you over and put you back where you belong, so to speak. I see real movement. And I think the other aspect of this, Soka, that gives me hope is there's far fewer of us willing to be quiet and not find alternative methods. With the rise of crowdfunding and doing things of this nature, we're finding alternative paths to get things done. And there's been so many examples of that, from Popcom, who raised money crowdfunding, to people who said, okay, I'm gonna go out here and convert customers to investors. We're learning how to play the game. And there's more of us like myself that are willing to be the translator and also give back at the same time, holding both sides of the rope, refusing to let go. So that gives me hope. There's more people and more investors, they're willing to sit down and have these conversations, such as Esther. There's more people that are willing to say, okay, what's really wrong with this? Because clearly something is broke. And it's not just from our side of the table, from the investor side, things that they used to bet on because they look like them and they aren't working out like that because he looks like me, she looks like me, we'll give them money. What happened? Crashed and burned. You can watch Startup Forensics and see exactly what happened. Too many companies have done that. And so now they're going, okay, wait a minute, maybe that's not the safest way to do this. So all this is actually giving me hope. And just across the board, from both racial equity, economic equity, geographic equity, I really believe that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Plus, we're just not sitting down and getting rolled over anymore. Our voices are being heard.
Excellent response. And any other questions, feel free to add them. Deacon asked these two questions. Thank you, Demetrius, for bringing up many concerns. Right now, every corporation is out there saying they want to make change. We're bringing our small grassroots organizations to people, and the doors immediately close in our face because we do not have the financial foundation they expect us to have in place. The people we serve are the most underrepresented in the community. We make magic happen with pennies and ramen. How do we move forward when a seat at the table is reserved for Todd, not Raheem? You better go ahead.
You want my first answer?
Yes, please.
And since we're toward the ends of this, as we've already discussed, I'm me. So I can go and give a me answer. Build your own damn table.
Mm.
Guess what? What you're doing, you're bringing your organizations to the table, to your community. Leverage that eventually, and keep grinding, because eventually somebody's going to pay attention. But in the meantime, build your own table.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what we have to do sometimes, to show them that, guess what, we can build a table too.
Yep. I love it, and I would encourage others to do the same. I like a hybrid approach. Until you are fully capable, I want you to try it. But if you find this a little hard, you get on the table until you can jump to the one that you build it for yourself. I get two questions that I think is super important, and I'm going to get to Deacon's second question quickly before I get to Nick, who is a white male based on the we he used in his reference, and it looks like he might be an investor. So the second question from Deacon says, maybe I'm paranoid, but I'm wondering if the movement for all these companies or organizations to make DEI change is really an opportunity for them to get their hooks and startups under the guise of help. How do we navigate this? What are some red flags we should look for?
I'm happy to take that one.
Yep.
So I would say whether it is this question or any other question about, is that investor a good investor to get cash from? I think what's huge is talking to anybody else that they've invested in, understanding, was taking their money worth it? Period. It doesn't have to be a negative connotation, but even if it's a neutral connotation, they gave you cash, but you expected support and you got none. That says something about the investor. So yeah, I would definitely get referrals on your investor, back channel. If you ask them for a referral, they're of course going to put somebody in front of you that'll say great things. But other entrepreneurs aren't going to lie to you because they've been in your seat. And so I would say red flags there are if you are getting term sheets that seem really sharky, that seem like, this really doesn't make sense. Why is my valuation lower? And if it can't be explained, for example, it's a whole different story if you want to debate the merits of it. But if things just seem off in the term sheets, or if that investor has a bad reputation, then I'd say stay away. But if your term sheet looks good, if any questions you have can be rationally answered, and if you get good referrals from other investors, then I'd say, proceed with the same level of caution as you would bringing on a key employee or another partner.
Thank you so much for that, Esther. And Deacon, thank you for both of those questions. We appreciate it. And I'm glad we got to get those nuggets from Esther. Now, Nick Hughes, who represents the demographic we've been talking about all night. So I'm actually very happy that you asked this question. He says, for white males, especially in position of power or who are leaders, what initial actions would you suggest we take that will help the movement of equity for underrepresented founders? It's hard to know what to say at times and not do or say the wrong thing in the eyes of people of color, even if we mean well. And before Esther Demetrius goes, I'll just say, what does your social circle look like? Who in their circle reflects this underrepresented community that you're seeking to attract? Where could you go to get that ear? And do you actually have a relationship that is a diverse community of just regular people, friends, people you invite for weddings, birthdays? What does your social circle look like? Because that's the first part. And then I'll pass it on to Demetrius and Esther to answer the second part.
Okay. This is actually an interesting question. And I'm going to actually break this down when I answer, but I'm going to preface it with the last thing you said, Nick, actually indicates, and to me denotes what kind of person you are, which is a good thing. Because if you're concerned and you're saying that you mean well, that means you are the person that needs to implement this. I don't know, based on this, what your position is, but when you ask about position of power and or leaders, I'm gonna go back. It's interesting you use that terminology, because being former active military myself, a leader, you don't want to kick down the door. If it's something you feel is right and you mean well, then just do it. Convince others to do it. You know, what's the initial actions that I can suggest that will help? Start. I mean, and if you want to communicate to founders you run across, or, you know, don't worry about saying the wrong thing if you truly mean well. Esther said something great earlier, communicate. Because we can take it. We can take real honest feedback because you're still being helpful. That's the thing that people forget and don't understand. Ghosting us or just saying like, yeah, no. Especially those of us that have done our research and we know there's no real valid reason you're saying that. Like, don't give us generic, team. What about the team? The fact that there's 3 Black guys on the team? I need more details. Follow your heart on that, honestly, because if you mean well, you'll make the right decision. But if you're going to be that leader that you're implying that you are, or person in a position of power, then you start. That's the first action you can do. Start.
Esther?
So I remember when I first became an investor as somebody who came from the opposite of privilege, it was shocking to understand what small things that aren't visible on the surface come with being in a position of power. And so I had to learn really early on that asking somebody for something could mean that they're spending 10 or 15 hours putting something together. And they'll never tell me that. They'll simply send it. And so I had to be very clear about, is my ask important or not? Should I ask somebody if they have something published or not? And these are small examples, but the overall point of it is your request or your expectations have real consequences on people, and you will never hear that feedback from them. And it is so incredibly real. So really think critically when you make requests of folks. I would say secondarily, I in my last role was the only role that I wasn't investing cash. And so I was on the portfolio support side. And going from investor to non-investor to back to an investor was also a little bit shocking. And I will say some lessons learned as a result of that. Really talk to people on the other side and cultivate real relationships, not just, I'm going to talk business, it's going to be incredibly polished. Actually get to know them, be vulnerable with them, and you give them the opportunity to be vulnerable with you and give you real feedback. And I think that's something that's important for everyone to do, especially people who are in positions of power, whether that is positional, whether that is because the social constructs in society and a whole host of things around that. And then the last thing that I would say is I can understand why it feels like this is really high stakes. And you don't want to get it wrong, and you don't want people blasting you on Twitter for saying the wrong thing when you meant A and you accidentally said B. And so I do want to acknowledge that. And I will say, if you truly build deep and vulnerable relationships with people who don't look like you, who are going to give you real feedback, whether or not you want to hear it, they're going to check you on that in private before you say it in public. So truly building a diverse network is going to be the best way to move forward in a way that that helps you achieve your goals, but helps you do so really authentically.
Nick said, thank you so much for the thoughts. It was very helpful. And there was a word you were looking for earlier, Esther, and we couldn't find it, but I think the word was empathy.
Yeah.
We need more empathy in this process. Here's the thing. This is a capitalistic process that we are in. We're talking about money. how fast is the money moving, who has the money. If it's a volume play, there are some gaps there and some folks who will naturally be left out. But if we can if we can look at the long tail and realize that it is contributing to the growth on the higher end of the wealth accumulation you seek, or the ROI you seek from those investors, it's now time to invest in the long tail, but you get to determine how you're going to do it. Again, earlier I made the Brene Brown reference. She said the definition of privilege is not having the conversation because it's uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the people you're afraid of having the conversation with are still suffering because you don't even want to acknowledge what's in the room. And on the safer side is communication is key. People of color and marginalized communities have gone through a lot. So we have tough skin by nature. Have the conversation, have it with empathy. Google is a powerful tool. If you do the research first, then that further goes to show your commitment to this work. So for everyone who has joined, I want to say thank you so much. And we're about to close. Tony wanted to just note, please provide your any thoughts that you all have as a community. Please make sure that you connect with organizations like StartOut, that you attend these events, that you do get the insight. Connect with people after that. If you liked what Demetrius said today, reach out to him. Reach out to Esther if you want to partner on some things. And we want to just really thank you for this time. Lance or Tony, I'm not sure if you're still here, but I want to thank everyone. This is an excellent conversation. I appreciate the opportunity. And if they're still with us, Tony or Lance, I want to pass it on over to you to close it on out.
But we still here. That was amazing.
I loved it. When
Well, I
he
wanted
said
to-
table, I was almost passed out.
Totally. There was so many amazing points tonight, and I think we can all walk away with something. So thank you so much, Dominique and Esther and Demetrius, for this candid conversation. And I also want to thank Lance for being such a great partner in making this happen, as well as the rest of the steering committees in San Francisco and Los Angeles. So thank you all for your time today. We hope you have a wonderful evening and a wonderful holiday season. Thanks a lot.
Yes, happy holidays all.
Thank you.